Hello, and welcome to Grasping Reason, a channel about history, philosophy, and art. This video will be about Democritus and ancient Greek atomism. Before jumping into details about Democritus, there are a few points I should make regarding the broader topic of atomism, and why I'm using Democritus as a representative of it. The first point to make is that ancient atomism is definitely not modern atomic theory. Of course, there is some borrowed terminology, and there may be a good video to be made about the relation between the two theories, but that is not the purpose of this video. As such, I'd ask that if you know anything of modern atomic theory, try and divorce that knowledge from the ideas expressed in this video, even when you could spot similarities. Ancient Greek atomism sits quite neatly within the context of Presocratic philosophical evolution, and that is the frame of reference that I want to draw from rather than a modern one. The next point to be made is that by focusing on Democritus, I appear to be skipping over the earlier Greek atomist Leucippus. Leucippus is considered to be the founder of this atomistic theory, and he is considered the teacher of Democritus. The problem with making a video about Leucippus, however, is that there is very little we can say of him in isolation. If there were significant differences in the theories of Leucippus and Democritus, then they are no longer apparent to a modern reader. And while we have a large number of pieces of evidence for Democritus, we can't say the same for Leucippus. Some even go so far as to doubt Leucippus ever existed. Given all that, Democritus is simply the better option to examine this era of Greek atomism. Because their theories are intertwined, however, you could consider Leucippus as a less than equal subject of this video too. More than before Democritus, ancient Greek atomism had a healthy life after the pre-Socratic era. Epicurus in particular is firmly associated with the theory. We'll look at him and others briefly during the influences section towards the end of the video, but this video sits in a series on the Presocratic philosophers, and that would not include Epicurus or anyone from Plato onwards. Finally, in this preamble, I've made a point of highlighting the Greek in this ancient atomism up to this point, and I probably won't keep that up throughout the video. The reason I've done that, however, is because this isn't the only ancient theory of atomism. It likely wasn't even the first of these atomist theories. Classical Indian philosophy appears to be a wealth of interesting philosophical ideas, and a potentially earlier atomist theory is among them. My own philosophical studies, decades ago at this point, were focused almost entirely on Western philosophy though. Looking back, I think that's a shame, and I would encourage a more holistic view of the history of ideas for future students. But it does mean that area of philosophy is just too far out of my depth. The evidence of interaction between Greek and Indian atomists is too sparse and unreliable to be worth considering. The safest bet at this point is to say that the ideas evolved in isolation from one another. With all that said, let's start the video proper. Democritus is associated sometimes with the city of Abdera, on the Thracian coast of what is today northern Greece, and sometimes with the Ionian city of Miletus, on the western coast of the Anatolian Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. He was a near contemporary of Socrates, and apparently younger than Anaxagoras by about 40 years, which gives us a rough estimate of his birth being in 460 BCE. This puts him close to the end of the pre-Socratic period. He is said by Diogenes Laertius to have written a lot of books, around 60, although the fragments that survive to this day are only a small sample from these works, and are frustratingly skewed largely, as much as 4/5, to ethical concerns rather than to atomist theory. In case you haven't seen any of my other videos in the latter part of this series, let me state again, Parmenides was kind of a big deal. He's not the subject of this video, but his influence is writ large over the later pre-Socratics, and the atomists are no exception. To better explain the ideas of Democritus then, it is important to lay out the Parmenidean context they sit within. That context is really one of the broader Eleatic school, and the notable thinkers in it. Parmenides himself, Zeno with his paradoxes, and Melissus, a contemporary of Anaxagoras. Parmenides asserted that what is, and what is not, is not. These statements sound like simple tautologies, and in a way that is just what they are, but it is the implication of these statements that made Parmenides so influential. If something exists now, then it does not make sense to say that at some point it did not or will not exist. That would be akin to saying that what is not. At least it would in Parmenides' opinion. For a deeper look at his theories, you could watch my video on Parmenides, but in essence the idea is that there is no coming to be or passing away for existent things. What exists, exists eternally without risk of destruction or change. What does not exist will never exist. With Zeno came his paradoxes that sought to demonstrate that the common sense understanding of the world was at least as absurd as Parmenides' understanding. Of particular note for our purposes are the paradoxes of motion, that suggest a total spatial distance cannot be traversed without first traversing a division of that total. That division can always be further divided so that the total traversal becomes a secondary concern to making it to a smallest and ever smaller division. Again, I have a video on the paradoxes in this series that will explore them in detail, but the context required for our purposes is that Zeno casts doubt on the possibility of any motion, and further doubt on the notion of infinite divisibility. Doubt is Zeno's stock and trade, and it won't be right to say he asserted any particular philosophy, more that he offered challenges to be met by subsequent philosophers. He wants us to consider that if something can be infinitely divided, then there may be implications for common sense notions like that motion can occur. The challenge to subsequent philosophers is to make a statement on infinite divisibility without falling into the trap of his paradoxes. The last member of the Eleatic school we should look at is Melissus. I don't have a video on Melissus as he's a smaller figure in the picture of Presocratic philosophy, but his contribution was particularly important to the atomists, so I'll cover it here. In general, his work appears to be an often poor restatement of Parmenidean principles, going over the same arguments against change, limit, etc., as appears in Parmenides' poem, but one part of his work became influential. This is the way in which we must distinguish between what is full and what is not full. If a thing has room for anything else and takes it in, it is not full, but if it has no room for anything and does not take it in, it is full. Now it must needs be full if there is naught empty, and if it is full, it does not move. Melissus here expands on Parmenidean principles to say that for motion to occur, a void is required, a space occupied by nothing that can be moved into. He is a good Parmenidean and clearly believed he was ruling out the possibility of a void, and motion with it, by stating that a void must essentially be non-existence, and non-existence doesn't ever exist. As we'll see, however, the atomists disagreed with that conclusion. Now that we have the context of select areas of Eleatic influence on 5th century BCE philosophy, we can finally turn to atomism. You will see that the key principles of atomism seek to answer the particular Eleatic challenges that I presented as our context. So what is an atom? The word itself is an ancient Greek word, atomos, meaning uncuttable or indivisible. By definition then, the atom is the smallest possible thing. It contains no constituent parts which can be separated off from it. Whatever is the stuff in an atom must be fully present in all of that which we may call the atom, so that no part of it can be distinguished and thereby separatable from any other part. This gives an atomist answer to Zeno's challenge, that infinite divisibility is impossible because there is a smallest entity which is not subject to further division. To apply it to Zeno's paradox, we might say that traversal of a spatial distance may begin first with traversal of this smallest distance that an atom represents. Who knows if this would have satisfied Zeno? As to why we cannot divide an atom, the answer is only vague in atomist sources, and appears to largely depend on an appeal to the definition of the word atom. The best explanation I found is that given by the SEP article on Democritus. The solidity of atoms, the fact that there is no void within them, is said to be the reason why they cannot be split. This still appears to be an appeal to definition though. The solidity of an atom seems to me only another way of saying that there are no discernible parts to it. Regardless, the assertion gives us a key principle of atomism, that it denies the possibility of infinite divisibility. Atoms are also suggested to deny the possibility of coming to be and passing away. An atom is now, was always, and ever will be. We can see this as partly an implication from the first principle. The indivisible nature of atoms would appear to disallow destruction. This is also a firm agreement with Parmenides' assertion that what is, and the suggestion that to deny this is illogical. Change, destruction, and creation of these fundamental atoms is, by their nature, impossible. The perceptible objects of our world may indeed come to be at some point, may change, and may be eventually destroyed. But these objects are all constructions from atoms that are themselves unchangeable. Many of the later Presocratics answer Parmenides' challenge in a similar way, by stating that change can occur in the world, but the constituent elements, parts, or in this case atoms, are not subject to any change. It is important to note that there is not simply one kind of atom, but many different kinds that have their own shapes and textures. This is significant for when we apply atoms to the generation of our world, which we'll look at in more detail in a few moments. Before we do that, however, we have to address the final key principle of atomism. That is the concept of the void. We saw with my brief talk of Melissus earlier that the concept of void was first presented as something inherently unreal, or as non-existent. By application to the Parmenidean principle of what is not, Melissus wants us to agree that the void is not a thing at all, and because of this, motion cannot occur. The atomists turn this idea on its head, however. If motion can occur, then there must be a space for a thing to move into. There must be, in fact, a void. Aristotle associates Leucippus as well as Democritus with the deliberately paradoxical assertion that being is no more than not being, i.e., that void exists as much as the full or solid. This assertion gives us two types of real fundamental things: the atoms in their various forms, and the empty space, the void, that exists between the atoms. The key principles of atomism can be defined then as such. There are two types of real things: atoms and void. The void is an empty space in which there is nothing that exists. The atoms are indivisible, unchangeable units of pure existence, which move through this void. If these basic things are the only real things, how then do we get a world of things, the world that we can see and are ourselves a part of? We are told that this generation of objects occurs through a mechanism of atoms coming together, a combination, and change of those objects occurs by a rearrangement of those atoms. Macroscopic objects in the world that we experience are really clusters of these atoms. Changes in the objects we see, qualitative changes or growth, say, are caused by rearrangements or additions to the atoms composing them. Combination can occur between atoms thanks to the shape and the texture that a particular atom has. Hooks and barbs on the surface of these tiny particles can capture other atoms. I've already mentioned that there are a variety of different atoms, and the differences between them has been characterized simply by their texture and shape. We can imagine then that an atom shaped as a perfect cube is the same kind of atom as another with that shape. What we have not been told is whether the stuff that exists inside an atom is always the same. Are two cube atoms the same because the stuff they contain is the same and distinct from other atoms, or is it simply by size and shape? By omission of the former, we are led to believe that for the atomists it is the latter. It is only by size and shape that these atoms are distinct. We are also not told just how much variety there is in the size and shape of atoms. It could conceivably be an infinite amount of variety, but it could also not be. Regardless, these differences are enough for the atomists to assert that combination of them can produce the distinct objects of our lived experience. Like other pre-Socratic philosophies, atomism provides a cosmogony by which the full generation of a cosmos is defined in the terms of the key principles of the philosophy. Kirk, and Schofield in the Presocratic Philosophers gives us a staged account of this process. Bear in mind, however, that these stages are derived from testimonies of atomist philosophy by commentators, notably Diogenes Laertius, rather than from extant fragments. The first stage is when a large collection of atoms becomes isolated, as it were, in a large patch of void. The second stage is when they form a whirl or vortex. We know that both real elements of the world, the atoms and the void, are described as infinite in their ways. The atoms are innumerable, the void is an infinite expanse of nothingness. The first stage, then, suggests that these infinities are not homogeneously distributed, and that there may be an initial state of distribution that is important for beginning a cosmos. The second stage describes a particular type of motion, but unfortunately we get no indication of how that motion begins to occur, merely that it does. Going on, the vortex action causes like atoms to tend towards like. The larger atoms congregate towards the middle, the smaller ones are squeezed out. The principle of like to like was a common one in pre-Socratic philosophy, often featuring as an attractive force with no further explanation as to why like would attract like. Perhaps this is the way that particular objects categorize themselves in a vortex, thanks to what we now recognize as centrifugal, gravitational forces, that led to this becoming a common sense principle. Finally, we are told that a kind of membrane or garment encloses the whole. Whether this is formed by the smaller and extruded atoms, or whether these are thrust right out of the system or whole into the void, is uncertain. Other atoms come into contact with the extremity of the revolving mass and are drawn within the membrane. Certain of these atoms become ignited by the speed of the revolution, and so form the heavenly bodies. The bulkier ones at the centre stay together to form the earth. So, the world has an outer edge, at which more atoms are drawn in, and the lighter atoms are flung towards. The earth is composed of the heavier or larger atoms that are drawn towards the centre, the stars composed by the lighter atoms congregating at the outer limit. These combinations are held together, we can suppose, by the hooks and barbs that cover the surfaces of atoms. Yet, as we have been told that only atoms are unchangeable and indestructible, then the combinations that they produce can only be temporary compositions. As with this object generation on the large scale, in producing planets and stars, the same mechanism occurs for the smaller non-living natural objects that make up our world. This doesn't disallow man-made constructions, of course, or constructions by other living entities. The beaver's dam, for example, doesn't appear from the whirl. The water it controls does. The trees it is made from may also not be produced from the whirl. That depends on whether the atomists could view trees as living things, because there is a difference highlighted when it comes to living things. The atomists included an account of reproduction in living things. Democritus seems to have held that both parents produce seeds composed of fragments from each organ of their body. Whichever of the parts drawn from the relevant organ of the parents predominates in the new mixture determines which characteristics are inherited by the offspring. This certainly represents a distinction from the way that the cosmos has been generated, although this shouldn't be a surprise. It would have been absurd for the atomists to suggest that every living thing is generated from the world too. Yet, despite this distinction, there is an effort to relate the living things of the world to the broader theme of atomism. Of all the varieties of atoms there supposedly are in this system, we are given one specific example of particular importance. The fire atom is suggested to be perfectly spherical, and is also suggested to be the type of atom that makes up the soul. This understanding comes from Aristotle's testimony, as the SEP points out. According to Aristotle, Democritus regarded the soul as composed of one kind of atom, in particular fire atoms. This seems to have been because of the association of life with heat, and because spherical fire atoms are readily mobile and the soul is regarded as causing motion. If you're much of a pyromancer, this association of motion with fire may appear appropriate. The flames of a fire dance around with what appears like little impedance. The association of fire with the soul is not uniquely atomist, and the suggestion by the SEP that this is thanks to the equation of heat and life is a plausible explanation of why this was a popular conception of the time. The attribution of free motion takes up an atomist character, however, in saying that it is the perfectly spherical nature of the fire atom that allows this free motion. Without hooks and barbs, these atoms can move more freely past each other. What is not clear is how these atoms then come together to produce a thing greater than the atom in isolation. Without other explanations, Kirk, and Schofield suggest that it must be only by the attractive force of like to like. Democritus also concerned himself with a theory of perception, of how it is possible that we see the world of perceptible objects. On this issue, Democritus's philosophy is not too dissimilar from Empedocles. Empedocles believed in the idea of effluences, that every object gives off a kind of description of its composition and form that is then picked up by the human senses. We get to know the composition and form of an object thanks to these effluences giving us their information. The atomist version of this philosophy is given by Democritus and is appropriately tied in to wider atomism. Democritus' theory of perception depends upon the claim that eidola, or images, thin layers of atoms, are constantly sloughed off from the surfaces of macroscopic bodies and carried through the air. When this thin layer of atoms touches the sense organs of the perceiver, then, just as with Empedocles' theory, information about the composition and form of the object is transmitted to that perceiver. It is tempting to trace an influence from Empedocles to Democritus on this matter, especially as Empedocles was a slightly earlier thinker. It may just as well have been the case, however, that both philosophers were influenced by ideas common to the Greek world around this time. Democritus applies this theory also to knowledge more generally, however, believing that we attain not just perceptive knowledge, but all thought from the interaction of these floating atoms with our senses. The thought, "I'm thirsty," may perhaps be induced by the perception of a glass of water, for example. The implication of this theory is to remove much of the agency of an individual, and to reduce the properties of mind to a blank slate simply waiting for input. This has led to Democritus being understood by some as a skeptic. Some of the extant fragments certainly seem to back this up. We, in actuality, grasp nothing for certain, but what shifts in accordance with the condition of the body and of the things which enter it and press upon it. Given what we have been told about what the nature of the world around us is, this skepticism seems consistent with the rest of atomist theory. Remember that we have only two ultimately real types of things in the world, atoms and the void. We, using our senses, experience neither of these things directly, but what appears to us is the unreal and temporary combinations of the atoms that we can call objects. One of the most famous of the Democritian quotes from the same extant fragment I just quoted asserts just this. By convention sweet, he says, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention colour, but in reality atoms and void. The perceptible world of objects, and even the characteristics of those objects, are all mere conventions, ways to describe the world from a point of imperfect perception. If we had perfect perception, then we would see the world as it really is, composed of indivisible atoms and the space between them. It wouldn't be appropriate to leave behind a discussion of Democritus without touching on the part of his philosophy that appears to have had greatest ancient impact. I mentioned at the start of this video that the vast majority of extant fragments concern Democritian ethics. Despite that disparity of content, however, there isn't that much to be said about it. Not that a lot of topics aren't covered, just that they can be reduced to a fairly simple axiom. Democritus was known as the laughing philosopher, thanks to this axiom, which was basically the virtue of good cheer. Rather than this being a simply hedonistic philosophy, however, there was an emphasis on an understanding of the self that could help to manage expectations and being cheerful while also recognizing your own limitations. Men attain good spirits through enjoyment that avoids extremes of want and satiety, and through a life commensurate with such enjoyment, or perhaps with their own natural abilities, anything else makes for upheavals in the soul, precluding stability and good spirits. This doesn't seem to me to be a bad foundation for a good life, but it is a theory of goodness that finds a better home with Epicurus. If these ethical considerations can be linked to the more metaphysical principles of atomism, then it is never a certain link. I may be demonstrating my own bias here, but I find little more to say on the issue, other than to point out again that Epicurus readily took on this element of Democritian philosophy. And that gives me the opportunity to move on to discuss how Democritus influenced subsequent philosophy. Epicurus appears around 150 years later than Democritus, and expanded on all areas of Democritian philosophy. The Epicurean school is sometimes associated with a hedonistic outlook, but, as with Democritus, the priority of pleasure is not supposed to be entirely unfettered from the limitations of the self or the happiness of others. Epicurus highlights the notion of ataraxy as the primary goal, which can be understood as equivalent to mental calm. Rather than seeking pleasure as an object, the ultimate goal of Epicurean ethics was contentedness in relation to the possibilities and limitations of the self. This seems to me like an advancement on the more basic Democritian ethics, and is why I said these ethics find a better home in Epicurus. Most who have heard of Epicurus and Epicureanism are probably most aware of the ethical concerns he propounded, but he also represents a development of the rest of Democritian philosophy. Epicurean atomism makes some useful advancements from the earlier Greek atomism. He gave an initial motive cause to atoms that was unfortunately missing in Democritus, much to Aristotle's dismay, stating that the atoms have a tendency to move downwards. Further motion is caused by atoms colliding with one another, and that much was present in Democritus, but initial cause certainly fleshes out the theory. Among other advancements, Epicurus also makes a firm link between his ethical concerns and his atomist doctrines, suggesting that atomist beliefs lead to a better life for their proponents. Even before Epicurus, there is some definite influence by Democritus on the broader philosophical discourse of the era. Plato's dialogue Timaeus also suggests a kind of atomism, explaining the world from the basis of indivisible minimal units. Plato himself never mentions Democritus specifically, however, so any influence there is only really hypothetical. Aristotle, on the other hand, mentions Democritus frequently, and does so as an important rival in natural philosophy. We shouldn't overstate the influence of a rival, but the fact that Aristotle gives Democritus' ideas plenty of examination just goes to show how influential those ideas must have been at the time Aristotle was writing. While the evidence of influence in the ancient Greek world is rather forceful, we should certainly recognise the importance of atomism for the modern era. I started this video by saying that we shouldn't confuse ancient atomism with modern atomic theory, and that remains the case. Modern atomic theory exists in a space of scientific inquiry that is entirely different to the way ancient philosophers operated. But the fact that we now call some of the very small units of existence atoms is a recognition of the influence from Democritus and the other atomists. When modern atomic theory came about, there was a belief that these things would be the smallest indivisible units of existence. That they turned out to be divisible and to yield yet smaller things means the name is now a little unfortunate perhaps, but it at least does justice to the impressive ideas of this particular ancient philosophy. Thanks for staying with me on this video. It certainly ended up being longer than I expected when I made the first essay plan for the script. That plan now looks quite different to what survives my editing, but I hope that the main themes of ancient Greek atomism has been expressed sufficiently anyway. Please press all the good YouTube buttons before you leave, and if you think I missed something important, then please let me know in the comments section. Thanks, and goodbye for now.